On January 24, 1978, an unexpected surprise fell onto Canadian territory, the Soviet satellite Cosmos 954 with a nuclear power plant on board. As a result of its fall, more than 100 radioactive fragments were scattered across 10% of northwestern Canada. The Soviet Union insisted that the contamination was minor, while the Canadian and American sides admitted that the contamination was significant. The radioactivity during the fall reached up to 200 rings per hour. 124,000 square kilometers had to be cleared of radioactive fragments. Let me immediately allow myself a small digression, a little background. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union began launching dozens of nuclear satellites into space en masse. The first nuclear satellite was called Transit. It was launched by the United States in 1961. It was the first satellite navigation system, even before the advent of GPS. Such satellites were launched over the next 30 years. Many of them are no longer operational, but are still in orbit with an intact nuclear reactor. And the Soviet Union began launching nuclear satellites in 1965, and each of them carried a small nuclear reactor on board to power various devices. These were so-called spy satellites. They were intended to track ships and submarines of the U.S. Navy. Cosmos 954 was equipped with a BS-5 nuclear power plant, also known by the code name BUK, which powered the onboard side-scan radar. Just a short clarification, BUK is a nuclear power plant. It has been produced at the Red Star Scientific Production Association since 1970. A total of 31 satellites were launched, which were equipped with a BUK launcher. The first device of the series was launched in 1969 from the Baikonur Cosmodrome under the name Cosmos 367. So, it turned out that already on the second orbit the core melted, and this satellite had to be buried in the ocean. Let's move on. The reactor core consisted of 37 fuel rods with the minimum possible gap between them. Each fuel rod contained 3 uranium-molybdenum blocks 55 mm long, and 2 barrel blocks 100 mm long, forming end neutron reflectors. The total mass of uranium is 30 kilograms, enriched with the 235 isotope up to 90%. The reactor vessel in the form of a hexagonal prism with a key size of 140 mm was surrounded by a side beryllium reflector 100 mm thick. 6 barrel rods moved parallel to each other in the reflector. These are the reactor controls. The mass of the satellite was 4,300 kilograms. It was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome on September 18, 1977, and the UN Secretary-General was officially notified of this event. Space 954 operated normally for just over a month. On October 28, 1977, ground services suddenly lost contact with it. The reason is still unclear. Perhaps there was a malfunction of the correction engine. The control center attempted to move the faulty satellite into a higher orbit for safe disposal, but the operation failed. Foreign colleagues were also not asleep at this time. Problems with the satellite were noticed by the North American Aerospace Defense Command. They monitored all satellites and objects in outer space and noticed that the Soviet satellite had lost its orbit, and therefore poses a potential threat due to a possible fall to the ground. If you ask the question of what actually happened to the satellite, then in fact the real reason is still unknown, although there are a great many different versions. The simplest and also the official one is the failure of the correction engine. But there is another version, which is called unlikely, but still acceptable, namely the use of laser weapons against a satellite. And some experts claim that the Soviet satellite was nevertheless shot down by the American military when it flew over an Australian test site where various secret missile launches were carried out. That is, this version also exists and is accepted by some specialists. It is accepted and considered. Let's move on. Intelligence reported that the satellite has a nuclear power source. The Americans believed that it was like a daisy, so the U.S. National Security Council ordered the Department of Energy to prepare for the fall. and by December 19, a group on space debris was formed. For those who don't know, the Chamomile was the first Soviet nuclear power plant. It was produced at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy in 1964, but it was never used in space, so the Americans made a little mistake here. On January 6, 1978, the instrument compartment depressurized. Space 954 became completely uncontrollable, began to rotate and descend rapidly. The fact that a Soviet reconnaissance satellite with a nuclear reactor on board is inexorably approaching the Earth has become known to the whole world. Western media wondered where this uncontrollable radioactive colossus would fall, and due to its unpredictability, this event was called Russian roulette. On January 14, after an official request from the Americans, the Soviet side confirmed that the satellite was indeed equipped with a nuclear reactor and was completely uncontrollable. On January 24 at 6:53 a.m., the satellite entered the dense layers of the atmosphere, partially burning up. This event was recorded by a space object tracking station located in Hawaii. Well, as we already know, fragments of what was left of the satellite fell on the northwestern regions of Canada. A fireball in the sky was seen by many. It is assumed that space in 954 entered the atmosphere over the islands of Hawaii, and then hit the Earth's surface in the area of /U200b/U200b Great Slave Lake. Immediately after the incident, U.S. President Carter contacted Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau and offered assistance in searching for radioactive remains of the satellite and reactor. The Canadian government agreed. American liquidators arrived in Canada on the same day. The search operation was based at a Canadian military base in the suburbs of Edmonton, Alberta. The operation to eliminate the consequences was codenamed Morning Light. This name was given because the fall occurred in the early morning. The first stage of the operation consisted of checking the area from the air using planes and helicopters. As a result, an 800-kilometer fall area was determined. The second stage of the operation was to search for the remains of the satellite. The first object was found 2 days after the fall on January 26. In total, about 1,000 fragments of a nuclear reactor, rods, disks, tubes, and smaller parts were found, the radioactivity of which ranged from a few milliroentgens per hour to 200 roentgens per hour. The total mass of the finds reached 65 kilograms. Experts managed to collect more than 90% of the radioactive fission products from the satellite's reactor. The total cost of the operation exceeded $14 million. And, by the way, exact information about exactly how much the USSR paid Canada for all the costs incurred during the collection and disposal of satellite debris. No one has such information. Until now, this is all classified, but some experts say that the amount of compensation could reach from $3 to $8 million. Thanks to this accident, American intelligence agencies received the opportunity to study secret Soviet space technologies. And it was the employees of various U.S. law enforcement agencies who collected and took with them most of the debris from Space 954. And, by the way, the Soviet Special Services even considered this simply fantastic option to send several divisional groups to Canada, which were supposed to collect these debris so that they would not fall to, so to speak, the enemy side. But after a series of meetings, the country's leadership still decided that this risk would be too great. And if the Soviet spies are nevertheless detained, then this incident could simply worsen relations between the United States and the Soviet Union at that time. After this accident, after this international scandal, the Soviet Union temporarily suspended the launch of satellites of the series. These satellites were improved, all the bugs were corrected, and they began to be launched again. And, by the way, there was another accident with the satellite of the series just a few years later, namely in 1983. The satellite, which was also equipped with a nuclear power plant, fell in the South Atlantic region. And already in 1989, launches of such spacecraft were completely stopped. According to experts, about 29 such satellites are now in orbit around our planet and pose a potential threat. And all because after some time they will all begin to fall onto planet Earth.